Book Worms Horror Podcast is sponsored by Creepy Crate. Creepy Crate is a horror and true crime subscription box filled with spooky collectibles, macabre accessories, and terrifying goodies. Each bi-monthly box is filled with over $85 of terror and includes at least one horror or true crime book. This box delivers dread to your doorstep for just $39.99 with free shipping. Go to creepycrate.store to subscribe. Use the code BOOKWORM5 at checkout to get $5 off your subscription. That's BOOKWORM5 for $5 off your subscription. And now to the show. Welcome to the Book Worms Horror Zine podcast. I am James Ippoliti, host of the Real Demons of Pop Culture podcast, as well as TikTok's famous Demon Hunter. Joining me is Regina St. Clair. Her writing honors include a Waddy Award for Best Horror Novel, as well as multiple screenwriting awards, including a Webby honoree. Regina is also the contributing editor of the best-selling Local Haunts, a Horror Tube anthology. You can find Regina and her alter ego Batilda at her BookTube channel, Regina's Haunted Library, and on her blog, rstclair.com. We are both the editors of the Book Worms Horror Zine, and a great zine needs great fiction. We created this weekly podcast to offer writers quick tips on writing for the genre. Now, I'm currently in the office of Demonology, and how are things over there in your haunted library, Gina?
Oh, just fabulous. I've been doing a lot of reading outside, though, because it's been so nice. But yeah, I've just put in a brand new bookshelf for my fantasy and sci-fi books, so I'm expanding.
Awesome. Before we get into any questions, how can a writer submit to the Book Worms Zine?
Well, I know that we're currently looking for fiction for our summer issue, and anyone who wants to send in a fiction submission should mail it to my address, my studio address, which I'm sure, James, you can list on your podcast somewhere.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, we'll put it in the show notes. And the reason that I'm only accepting, well, I say James is part of this too, only accepting mail-in this time around is the first time I put up a request for submissions, I received over 600 short stories, which was great, but it took me 3 months to read them all. And since I'm looking at a June release for this next zine, I really don't have time to read that many stories. However, if anyone who previously submitted who thinks that their story might fit the theme, which is summer horror, however you would like to interpret that, and it's 1,500 words or less, you can just send me a little reminder email at exlibrisregina@gmail.com. Although now, I don't know if you know this, James, we have a new email address, which we can put in the show notes too. It's bookwormszine@gmail.com, I think. I have to look that up.
All right, yeah, I'll make sure we put that in the...
Yeah, I'd rather send it there just to keep it separate because I got so many submissions.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I know that some people who don't live in the United States maybe don't want to mail something overseas. I understand, but it's just trying to control the amount of stories that I receive because I never expected to get that many, and I want to make sure I can really read each one, and it just takes a lot of time.
And I honestly think that if you're really serious about this, actually printing out paper and mailing it is not much to ask.
I agree, and it's also part of the spirit of the zine.
Exactly.
We're trying to do things all old school, which means you actually mail a story in, and then the zine is mailed out. It's not available. I mean, you can buy it online through the Etsy link, but or you can send in a coupon, old school, to our address, but you can't view it online, and that was part of the philosophy behind this. So we're trying to keep it old school.
And for us to get good submissions, we've developed this podcast so we can talk about writing for the genre and very short episodes, basically talking about a quick tip each week. How can we be better horror writers? And today's topic is what is a horror author? How would you answer that question, Gina?
I think that a horror author, it's interesting because when I put, for the first round of submissions on Bookworms, the first issue, I posted something, I forget which site, on a Facebook site for call for horror submissions. And I remember, because we're paying a pro rate, 8 cents a word, which I guess is pretty good, there was a lot of interest. But I did notice some comments were like, oh, it's so hard to write in that genre. Horror is so difficult. And I'm thinking, well, maybe you shouldn't, not like to discourage anyone, but it's like if you don't already write horror, I mean, you can try it. You know what I'm trying to say? I feel like there are horror writers like there are romance writers. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people can, like a Dean Koontz or whatever, can write in every genre possible because he's that kind of craftsman. But and also he learned to do that just to keep, the pot boiling, as they say. But that sort of surprised me that there are writers would be interested in this, even if they've never written horror or it's not their main genre. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we're a certain breed.
It is definitely a certain breed, and you brought up a great point. Because we're paying a pro rate, people are going to try to dip their toe into this genre to see if they can do it. And anyone can write horror, but what we want is great horror.
Right.
You can attempt to write this, but I know personally, I don't ever explore other genres. Like, I wouldn't write romance, and I think the closest I would go outside of horror would be science fiction, and even then it would probably have a dark twist to it. And I know yourself, you've written young adult, but everything you write, even if there's a romance to it, is always dark.
Always. I mean, and the thing with romance, I know they have to have that happy ever after. and I did 2 series, and they do kind of end happy ever after, but there's a lot of suffering before we get there. But I think that if you're a horror author, you know the genre, I would say. Like, you read horror. It doesn't mean that you can't try a different genre, and I agree that, people should feel free to try something new. I do know from a lot of the submissions that I received, I wouldn't consider, I would say maybe a quarter of them, roughly, were not horror at all.
Expand on that. What do you mean by they weren't horror at all? When you're reading, what are you looking for to say this is a horror story?
Well, horror is a main genre, and then you have lots of different threads coming out of that. But it has to have some kind of horror element where it's something that is, for lack of a better word, frightening or scary, or there's a difference between that and a story that is like an action war story, like a military story. It might have violence in it, but it's not the same as a horror story. I think a horror story has to be something, it could be supernatural. Right. That's usually how it plays out, something supernatural, or it could be a serial killer, which would not be supernatural, let's say, like a murder, but then you get into, is this a mystery? So it's kind of a fine line, but I would say horror has to have some kind of gruesomeness in it on some level. And some might disagree with that. But the ones that some of the stories that I received that I would say weren't horror, which were perfectly fine stories, were maybe would be put under the psychological horror.
Would it be psychological horror or psychological thriller? maybe it's
more of a thriller.
I noticed that horror now, when you in Bookworms, there's actually a really good article, or at least it's your little comic strip, where when you go into a bookstore, it's like the horror section is so tiny,
right?
And sometimes it's just listed under thriller.
Or mystery.
Or
fantasy.
Yeah, it's very hard. I wish they would just create a true horror section for people who are looking for that. Stephen King is thought of like the horror writer, but he also has written all over the place. I'm reading Fairy Tale now, which I wouldn't consider that a horror story. And I
Right.
think it's the title even says fairy tale. It's exactly kind of him diving into the Neil Gaiman world of fantasy, I think.
Right.
But he says and if you haven't read this, Stephen King's On Writing, it's a memoir of the craft. Great book. But,
it's excellent. I've reread it several times, and I always go back to it. It's great.
and so he has a quote, read a lot, write a lot is the great commandment. How does reading a lot help a writer?
Well, if you're a horror writer or just any writer.
I think it works for any writer, but
Right.
but in horror, how can that help us?
Okay, I just want to interject that I myself that I do read across genres, but mostly horror. It helps because you know the genre. Like, if anyone wants to develop their horror writing skills, the best of horror that comes out every year,
Yeah.
pick that up. You can get it in the library and read what are considered the best horror stories, and then you kind of know what the genre is about. Or go back into the classics, like you mentioned Stephen King. I feel like he's definitely veered off for horror for many years.
Yes.
The last book I think I read of his, like a newer one, was it The Institute? I think that's
I don't
what
even
it's
know
called.
that's considered new at this point. I don't know. He
Oh, I
writes
know.
So
I
fast.
I can't keep up with him. I can't, and I know some people do read everything that comes out, but like that, I wouldn't consider that horror. It was kind of like a sci-fi thriller in a way. It was very cool. I loved it, but so I think horror. There has to be some like blood and guts or some like gruesomeness. And that can be, I mean, not saying it can't be psychological. There's ways of doing it that, which are very, of course, very well done. But I feel like it has to have some gruesomeness in it, whether that's blood or like a gruesome scene. Like I was watching, I'm watching all the Hellraiser movies from like start to finish, and of course the first two are the best and directed by Clive Barker. But they're so like I remember reading a lot of Clive Barker interviews and stuff, and he was like a big B movie fan when he was young, and he said he wants to see the blood, he wants to see the gore. And you really see that in his films that and of course the sequels and everything kind of, maybe not as great on a lot of ways, but there's blood and guts in it, and it's gory and it's fun and it's dramatic. I mean, that's what I personally look for. If a story is too, I guess, psychological, I might, not that I don't enjoy that. I actually wrote a novel that's more like psychological thriller, or two of them actually. But, I feel like for this zine, because it's old school, I'm kind of looking for like the early Clive Barker, like Books of Blood, like that kind of stuff. Now, Clive Barker, of course, veered off into mostly fantasy too. I wish he would go back to full out horror.
Yeah, I think overall, if it makes you uncomfortable in a sort of a spooky way, like I think Blood and Guts is a lot of fun. If you're just writing something that is violent for violence sake, then you're just getting into sort of like a
like extreme horror and.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't even know if I would call it horror. It's almost like a snuff film on paper.
Oh yeah.
Like we have to care.
Right. No, I'm really not into. I mean, I know there's a big fan base for that kind of horror. I don't really read it because it doesn't really appeal to me. But yeah, I mean that's part of the genre, definitely. I mean, like I read was like a Jersey Devil story. I think it was called The Jersey Devil, and it was great because it had a kind of a cartoonish old B movie feel to it, with like a lot of like ripping out throats and but it was entertaining as hell, I have to tell you. And it really was that fine line between, I guess, like spatterpunk and like something else.
There's a book called The Troop by Nick Cutter. I don't know if you've read that, but it follows a group of boys who are taking a weekend camping trip by their scoutmaster. It's an island off the coast of eastern Canada. And this is one that I read that, didn't think it was amazing, but when it came to like the gore and the stuff that was going on, it was so well written that it really made me like cringe.
Yeah.
And that really stuck out to me. Like I could feel the ooze or the blood or the everything. It was just so well described. It's a good book to read if you want to kind of see what we're talking about. And that said, besides reading horror, which what books would you recommend? Like maybe about this, about what have you read that's really gory? And you brought up books of blood. Would that be something?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'm thinking maybe down the line we'll do like a splatterpunk issue for Bookworms, you know, and kind of go explore that genre, subgenre or whatever, because it's very popular. But yeah, I like just my personal taste. As I like horror that is dramatic and bloody, but it doesn't go into like such a sad nihilistic place. You know what I mean? Right. That's just, I mean, and people do read that too, but I always feel like sad and, depressed after reading some, what would be considered like some extreme horror. It depends. But,
yeah. I find myself more nihilistic when I write. I don't know if I always have happy endings. It's always like kind of, I don't even know if there's a lesson, but I think that really comes down to the author and how they're able to put that in there and make us care and make us maybe in our own eyes see the hope at the end of the book.
You do have to care.
Yeah.
I will say that. Like that, and that is all about character.
Which will be another episode, I'm sure.
Will be another episode, sure. But yeah. So it's hard to say how to become a good horror writer. I mean, I'm still working on it. I think you have to be able to kind of go into those places of discomfort. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wrote a short story that was probably one of the grossest things I ever wrote. And I know that it might be too gross for some people, but like for me, I explored like the limits of what I could like handle in grossness, and so I think it's fun to just explore that and see how far you want to take it.
Which I think Bookworms is great because it's very short story. So we were talking up to 1,500 words that we're asking for. This, if you want to get into this genre, I think picking up a copy of our premiere issue will help you see what we've already put in there.
Yep.
And there's no better way of getting better at something than doing it over and over and not quitting. And this is not ask much, like, hey, I want to, if you get rejected, then you got another chance to get into the next issue. But it's going to make you better in the genre. One thing that happens is if you don't know the genre and you don't read it, you start doing tropes that you kind of think the genre's about.
Right.
And we want to sort of avoid that. We want to, if there's something that is, you want to do vampires, how can you do vampires in a new way with your voice?
Yes, like I thought the one story that's in Bookworms, What Slays in Vegas by Angelique Fons is a vampire tale, but I felt like she really put a fun spin on it.
Yeah.
And I cared about the characters, and it was a little more comical, but I felt like that I wanted a bit of a balance, so I liked that story a lot. And then some of them are a little different.
Yeah, Bookworms is a fun thing. It's not something you're going to get and like turn off the lights in your room and cut yourself,
No, God, no.
We're not trying to upset you. There's a lot of fun and enjoyment in Bookworms, and we love the genre, and you can have fun with these horror stories. It doesn't have to be dark all the time,
Yeah, or it can be like I felt like the Miss Sheridan's Window, the first story in the issue, that's more like a quiet horror, and it's more of like a creepy vibe. But it really, like when I'm reading something, I guess the test is kind of does this make me like, does it give me the chills or makes my hair stand up on the back of my neck? That's like an instant win, or makes me like giggle in a way, like that evil kind of laugh. Anything that kind of has that effect. Or, when you're reading something and you're like, oh, I know where this is going, and it goes there, you're kind of like, I've read this before, or I've seen this before. But something that is titillating or surprising. And I thought, like, the other stories are great too. And Bruce Golden's story is really kind of like a downer, but it almost felt like one of those, like an old Twilight Zone episode that ends very ironically.
Yeah.
And that's another thing with a short story. You can't beat a good twist.
Yeah. But it's hard, and I think we'll talk.
No, that is hard.
I think we'll talk about that in another episode because that's
that's
definitely
kind of specific.
Something, that's specific, and we'd have to really dig deep into that. But I think everyone's homework for this week would be to read. If you aren't reading something horror, start reading horror.
Yeah, start with Clive Barker's Books of Blood. Like, seriously, you can't get any better. And I just reread his Hellbound Heart, the first, his novel that the Hellraiser's based on.
Yeah,
his
I want to read that.
Oh, it's so good. And he enters like strong on the first line. And that's another thing I would say. Maybe this is another episode.
It is.
Okay, well, we'll save that. But you got to grab them right from the start on a short story. It's hard. It's its own sort of art form.
Yeah, this stuff we're talking about is not easy, but that's why we're going to continue to do these tips and tricks to get you, have little exercises to do to work on twist endings or work on first lines. But the first thing you need to do is be a fan of the genre and know what is already out there and write every day.
Yeah. Yeah, and short stories are the best place to start.
Yeah. Actually, I think it was Ray Bradbury, another one of my favorites.
Oh, yeah.
Who said, if you wrote a short story every week for the year, there's no way you'll write 52 bad short stories. You will get an amazing story out of that, at least one.
Definitely.
And that's great advice.
And I also think short stories, I'm a big believer in setting constraints. So having a 1,500 word, I know, of course you can write more and pare it down, but having a word count limit, having a specific genre, that actually helps your focus.
Absolutely.
You want to get to a certain place and start, throw yourself right into it and just have fun with it. And that's the thing you mentioned about bookworms. It's definitely, I wouldn't say it's comedy, but it's fun.
No. Yeah, it's fun. It's not comedy. I don't know if I sounded like I was saying that, but I wasn't.
No, I'm not. I'm saying when we say fun, it's in that I think horror fans are oh, that movie was fun, and it's one of their friends will go see it, and they'll be like, that wasn't fun, that was horrible. It's well, it was fun for me, because I'm a horror fan.
Yeah, it's fun. Like how the old eerie comics were and things like that.
Yes, well, I'm a huge fan of eerie and creepy.
Yeah, that's kind of a vibe that we love, and I think we hope it comes across in Bookworms. And definitely with Charles Radcliffe and his artwork.
Yep.
I think we get that.
Yes.
And the other thing you brought up about limitations, I'm reading the book The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, and it's a great book.
Okay. Rick Rubin, the music producer?
Yep.
Okay.
And he has just released a book called The Creative Act, and all it is about that, the Creative Act. And he does speak up about how limitations actually help us in that creative process. So I think people trying to write for Bookworms, I think it's definitely a great way, because when you have 1,500 words, you can't just ramble on.
Right.
You got to pick and choose the best words.
Yeah, and make it concise. And it's almost like, when I'm reading these submissions, I'm looking for that gut punch.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for that story that's whoa. Oh, I never thought of that. Oh, that's good. That's so scary. That's creepy. When I get that reaction.
Yep.
That's a story that's going to, go right to the top.
Yeah, especially if you're at home reading at night alone, and then you're all right, I think I'll read this tomorrow morning when the sun comes up.
Right.
That's a good story.
That's a really good story. Yeah, if it's too scary to read by yourself alone. Yeah. So knowing the genre is, being a fan of the genre. And I think that any horror fan who's been afraid to write their own horror, if you really know the genre, just try it. But if you're just a writer in a different genre and you're doing horror for money, I'm not saying it's not going to work, but I think you're going to have to work really hard to make that work.
Yeah.
Does that sound bitchy? I don't mean to.
No, I think I don't want to discourage anyone from writing
No,
horror.
I don't either.
You might be the next Stephen King, and we don't know.
Right.
I want you to try it and see if it calls to you. If you haven't written horror, do it and see if it works for you. If you find yourself loving it, then maybe you didn't know this about yourself.
True. And if you're a fan of like good horror movies, like maybe just like ask yourself what it is about that movie that or TV show or whatever that you really like.
Right.
Like try to break it down into what is it?
Yeah.
Like is it the thing behind the wall that's making a noise? That would be more quiet horror, and that's a great place to explore.
All right, so I think we have work for you guys to do who are listening, and next week we'll have a new topic and tips for that. You can pick up the premiere issue of Bookworms at the Etsy link in the show notes. You can also find the links for us, for Regina and myself, for the podcast, for the books. All that stuff will be in the show notes as well. And that's all I've got. What about you?
Yeah, and just where to send submissions if you'd like to try for the next issue. Summer horror, that could be a lot of things. It could be creepy carnivals, summer vacations from hell,
Yeah.
sea monsters, which
Yeah.
I know you're a fan of,
I'm
James.
a big fan.
And what else? Anything? Camp stories?
Yeah, summer camp.
Summer camp.
All that stuff like that.
Water slides.
Yeah. There's so many things that, just even outside at night in the summer when you're like, I know Bradbury, again, was really great at that, where it was just these kids in the summer at night and something creepy happens, It could be a carnival in town.
Well, here's a homework assignment, just thinking about it. And this would be like a really good psychological horror, is The Summer People by Shirley Jackson. Very short
yes.
story, major gut punch. And I almost felt sick after reading this. It's so good.
All right. Well, there's your homework. And we'll be back in a week with more tips on helping you write for the genre.
Okay. Good
Bye-bye.
luck. Bye.
Bookworms is a Guerrilladelphia production.